They said she was crazy, unstable, too emotional to lead. And just like that, one whispered sentence turned into a headline. Because when a black woman is accused, no one asks for proof. Not the clients, not the investors, not the press. They believed him. They always do. 6 months later, she was sleeping on a bench at Union Station, wrapped in a thrift store coat, her sketchbook pressed to her chest like something alive. Her name was Danielle Harris. Half a year earlier, she was a rising architect, the youngest black woman co-founder of a 7-figure firm in the city. Harris & Cole Design built community centers, low-income housing, and parks that actually fit the people who use them. She had awards, panels, and investors taking notes. Then her partner, Ethan Cole, decided he wanted the whole stage. He didn't smash servers or break in. He used the world's easiest tool, a lie that fits the shape of what people already expect. He forged withdrawals, re-registered contracts, and let a single rumor loose. Danielle Harris had a breakdown. Within days, the board asked her to step back. Within weeks, her name was scrubbed from the website. Ethan smiled into cameras and described himself as the steady hand who saved the firm. Reporters printed it like a fact. When she tried to speak, editors called it messy. Lawyers wanted retainers. HR suggested she take some time. No one actually asked for proof. That's how bias works. An accusation against a black woman becomes a credential for everyone else to look away. She lost her apartment. Her accounts froze. The city that once put her face on a magazine cover acted like she never existed. Security guards walked past her on the bench and averted their gaze. When black women disappear, the world rarely looks up, but she still drew. The pencil was stubborn. Lines became roofs, windows, thresholds, order she could control. If she could still draw, she could still think. If she could still think, she could plan. Be sure to subscribe to the channel to find out how Danielle turned her greatest defeat into her betrayer's ultimate nightmare. One cold December morning, a little voice stopped by the bench. "Are you an artist?" the girl asked. Danielle looked up. A 7-year-old in a pink coat, gloves too big, a cup of cocoa steaming between her small hands. "You're always here," the girl said. "You don't have a home," Danielle smiled. "You don't have a mom?" The girl's face softened. "She went to heaven," she said. Then she pointed toward the cafe window, where a tall man in a navy coat paced on his phone. "That's my dad. He's always busy." Danielle followed her gaze. Michael Reed, CEO of Reed Development Group, standing with the posture of someone who had never had to explain himself. He had once said privately that Danielle's proposal for sustainable social housing was the kind of work the city needed. Then, when emails that said Danielle was unreliable circulated, his calls stopped. He'd chosen silence over truth. That night, in a shelter cot that smelled of bleach and old jackets, Danielle opened her sketchbook. Across a blank page, she wrote, Phase 1. It felt less like a plan and more like a promise. A week later, she saw them again, Michael and his daughter. The little girl ran toward the bench like it was a playground. "Daddy, this is the lady who draws houses," she said. Michael smiled, handed the girl a folded napkin. "You're Danielle Harris, right? The architect?" he asked. "Used to be," she answered. He flipped through her sketches with curiosity. "You've still got it." "We could use a strong eye. Small project, lobby redesign, charity or opportunity, whatever he called it, she took the job." Inside the company, recycled fluorescent lights and the hum of the copier smelled like possibility. She walked into conference rooms, kept her head down, and let the work speak. Her lobby concept was quiet and brutal in its honesty, natural light, intuitive circulation, seating that didn't feel like a cage. People noticed. Michael noticed. He offered praise, then gave her access to project files, partners' emails, and a folder labeled Cole Urban Group. Her breath stuttered when she opened it. The blueprints wore a design language she knew like the back of her hand. The file metadata still contained faint tags, old file names she had once used. Ethan hadn't even bothered to scrub every trace. He hadn't just stolen contracts. He'd repackaged her life as his resume. Danielle did not run. She called an ally, Eric Miles, a cybersecurity analyst she'd helped years ago when his startup folded under fraud. He owed her, and she owed the truth. They worked nights. Public library Wi-Fi, greasy spoon diners at 2 a.m., thumb drives tossed across sticky tables. Eric traced IPs, timestamps, and email headers. Danielle pulled old proposal drafts and cross-referenced public bids. Piece by piece, the pattern appeared like a structural plan. Ethan's network was a scaffolding of shell companies, paper, corporations registered in states that didn't ask many questions. He'd submitted forged environmental certificates, faked contractor licenses, and routed payments through offshore accounts. He pitched minority-led projects and then filled the boardrooms with men who looked like investors, while the money filtered out. And worst of all, he'd targeted people who the system already ignored. 27 investors, mostly women of color, single mothers, salon owners, neighborhood organizers, had trusted his pitch because the banks had turned them away. He promised them community development and returns. He took their savings. He built an empire on a foundation of other people's ruin. He targeted women who looked like me, Danielle said one night, voice low, because he knew no one would listen when we yelled. Eric nodded. You have evidence for federal charges, she set her jaw. I don't want him prosecuted for himself. I want the system that let him run to be exposed. They did not shortcut. They documented. Signatures overlaid, timestamps matched to flights, bank transfers lined up with social posts where Ethan toasted champagne on a beach he claimed was for closing deals. Each public selfie became a breadcrumb. Each forged certificate became a brick in the indictment. For months, Danielle built quietly. She recorded meetings. She used fragments of conversation as scaffolding. She contacted a freelance forensic accountant to trace where the small investors' money had flowed. She talked to clients who remembered the polite warmth of her office and the sudden strange absence when Ethan's story arrived. And while she arranged the pieces, she kept drawing. The pencil stayed. Spring arrived. She walked into Michael Reed's glass tower with a black folder under her arm and a calm that felt like iron. Before we talk design, she said, placing the folder on his desk, you need to read this. He read. His face changed. The small line at the corner of his mouth, politeness, sank into something sharper. Are you telling me Ethan Cole forged federal documents? He asked. Yes, she said. And the deal you're about to sign ties you to it. Michael's phone rang. Ethan's name lit the screen. Danielle asked, put him on speaker. Michael, my man, ready to make history? Ethan's voice filled the office. Confidence like perfume. Michael's reply was clinical. Before I sign, confirm EPA Certificate 2274C for the Southside Renewal Project. When was that cleared? Silence on the other end. Paperwork. Bureaucracy, Ethan stammered. Funny, Michael said. Because that certificate doesn't exist. The air went thin. Danielle walked to the phone and said, Hi, Ethan. He heard her. Flat. Oh, Danielle, you called me unstable, she said simply. You said it so people would stop asking questions. You weaponized a stereotype and built a career on it. You used my name to open doors and then you closed them on everyone else. You don't understand. Ethan's voice cracked for the first time. You used the world's favorite lie. When a black woman is accused, people look away. But I am here, and I have documented everything. Michael put his hand on the folder. I'm calling the investigators. By evening, Reed Development had handed the evidence to federal authorities. The next morning, the headlines changed tone. Cole Urban Group under federal investigation for fraud, forgery, and money laundering. The same networks that once labeled Danielle erratic, now called Ethan disgraced. Clients froze contracts. Bank accounts were frozen. Subcontractors who had taken payments found their checks bounced. Rosa Vega, one of the small investors, received a call from an agent who said the words she had waited for. You will be compensated. She clutched the phone and cried because someone finally heard her. Danielle didn't throw a party. She slept 8 hours in a real bed that week and woke up with a feeling she hadn't had in months, breathing. But justice in headlines is only the beginning. Rebuilding is the real work. As the firm grew, so did the stories of recovery. A playground designed on a reclaimed lot became a safe place for neighbors who had watched their children grow up with no green space. A converted laundromat turned into a community classroom, where adults learned drafting and CAD. Each project had a list of contributors that included community members and small investors, people who once had been preyed upon and now had seats at the table. News profiles followed. Not the viral smear that had ruined her, but measured pieces that highlighted method and community impact. Architectural journals revisited old articles they had published and corrected the record. It was not an apology in print. Apologies in print are rare, but it was recognition that matters for the long arc. One afternoon, a plain envelope arrived at the office. Inside, a note with shaky handwriting. Dear Ms. Harris, my name is Rosa Vega. I invested in Cole Urban Group because they said it was your project. He took everything. Because of you, we have houses again. Thank you. She put the letter between pages of an old sketch and carried it with her like a token of what real work meant. 2 years after the first whisper that ruined her, Danielle stood at a podium under a bright stage light. The National Social Design Award hung on the wall. The room smelled of polished wood and expensive cologne. Cameras flashed. Her firm had completed a multi-site housing program and a cultural center that actually belonged to the neighborhood, not to outside developers. She spoke briefly. 2 years ago, a man thought he could bury me under lies. He forgot one thing. The system that silenced me was never built for people like me. So we rebuilt it. We redesigned the system because it was never built with us in mind. The standing ovation felt like a release. In the front row, Michael Reed and his daughter Lily stood smiling. And around them sat the women who had been scammed. The same faces that had been ignored now applauding. Reclaiming the moment, somewhere miles away in a federal detention center, Ethan Cole watched the broadcast on a small television. The chyron read, Danielle Harris wins National Social Design Award. He turned off the set and stared at the dark screen. The woman he'd tried to erase had become the face of everything he had pretended to be. But before the final chapters closed, there was something Danielle wanted to do differently from the stories that end in one climactic win. She wanted people to understand the work, the slow dismantling of a fraud, the legal filings, the community outreach, the tracking of small donors, and the long process of returning funds. She wanted that texture in the telling because when erasure happened slowly, rebuilding should happen intentionally, and so she added one more line in her interviews, one she knew would matter on the channel that had once amplified the rumor. Be sure to subscribe to the channel to find out how Danielle turned her greatest defeat into her betrayer's ultimate nightmare. Was a nod to the way stories spread now, bite-sized. Hooks stitched to long, messy truth. She used the hook not to tease cruelty, but to make sure people who watched heard the full arc, the theft, the invisibility, the documentation, the federal case, the community recovery, and the long repair work. After the awards, she returned to her office. The work continued. There were lawsuits to support, community panels to attend, new designs to refine. She signed the paperwork that officially established a restitution fund, ensuring the investors who had lost their life savings would not be forgotten once the headlines cooled. She worked with prosecutors to make sure the victims were supported with legal aid, and she set up training so future small investors would know how to vet developers and protect contracts. She also took time to teach young, Black designers how to protect intellectual property, how to register designs, how to notarize drafts, and how to build legal safety nets for small firms. She spoke plainly about the racial dynamics that had facilitated Ethan's success and her fall. It wasn't a lecture. It was an instruction manual born from experience. Most days she still drew. The pencil scratches on paper were the same rhythms that had saved her. But now the sketches fed into real projects, school roofs that angled for maximum sunlight, housing units that doubled as tiny businesses, courtyards designed for festivals and funerals alike. On a quiet morning, she walked a completed neighborhood unveiling. Children ran on new sidewalks. Parents pointed at the community center's new mural. An elderly couple sat on a bench and nodded at the sound of laughing neighbors. A woman she did not know approached and placed a hand on Danielle's sleeve. "You changed everything," she whispered. "My kids sleep easier." That was the currency she had wanted all along. They had called her unstable. They had called her finished. They had tried to write her out. What they didn't understand was that architects do not simply make things look good. Architects design futures. They build the scaffolding for daily life. When someone takes away your work, they try to take away tomorrow itself. Danielle rebuilt not just a company, but a pathway for others to step up. She taught them how to guard the work that makes a life possible. She taught them to document everything. She taught them how to turn a rumor into a record. And when the story finally settled into its new shape, lawyers closing cases, restitution flowing, a man in a cell reading headlines. She sat on a bench with a coffee and a new sketchbook. Lily ran up, breathless, and handed her a drawing. A simple house, sun in the corner, a small door with hands reaching out. "It's for us," Lily said. Danielle smiled and tucked the drawing into the first page of the book. This time when she opened it, the future looked like a plan. They had underestimated the wrong woman. They had used a stereotype as a weapon and pretended it was truth. She had used proof as a tool and turned it into a foundation. When the world calls a black woman crazy for fighting back, it's not because she is loud, it's because she is dangerous to the way things stay the same. And when she learns how systems are designed to exclude, she does what architects do. She redraws the blueprint. If this story moved you, if you've ever been erased and wanted a way back, remember this: keep your evidence, keep your pencil, and keep building. The work is longer than headlines, but it lasts.